Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall Podcast. We're going to talk about a couple things today in this episode. We're going to talk about democracy. We are also going to talk about COVID and the Omicron wave. Whenever someone says, "Oh, we're going to talk about democracy," that always it's such a it from one viewpoint, it's such a generic anodyne thing that I often still feel like it's gonna be some insubstantial conversation because who even people who are against democracy say they're for democracy, and it's just kind of a common totem in American civic culture. Obviously, as we know, it is fairly contested at this point, and so there is a lot to talk about, and we're gonna get into that. Just in the last few days, President Biden gave this speech down in Georgia on the threats to democracy, to the republic that we face right now, and that is tied to this new push for some version of the For the People Act in the Senate. And again, For the People Act, this is the consensus democracy protection legislation that has been in the mix all year long, that we've been talking about. That is that. And then we also have, we're still coming off the anniversary of January 6th and the insurrection and all this kind of stuff. So we're going to get into that. And then we're also going to talk about what, I think it still depends to some degree where you are geographically in this country, how you are experiencing the Omicron wave. There's the beginning of some evidence now that we are just finally coming off the wave, or at least that it's plateauing in the New York City area. And I think there seems to be a kind of a common trajectory, I think, in the Washington D.C. area, in the Boston metro area, New England, basically the Northeast. I think New York may be a little bit ahead, but kind of all in the same basic wave. And if you're in a part of the country that has not kind of hit this yet, wow, it's pretty intense. And certainly my experience is that, from what I mean, the first of all is, you've gone the whole pandemic, and some people who've had COVID, a lot of people who've never had it, and then all of a sudden, like, everybody has it. Like, over the course of like a week, everybody has it. Um, I have some. It's affected my family now. Not in any bad way. Everything's fine, but it's kind of everybody suddenly getting it. Um, and what everybody says, whether it's because most of the people I know are vaccinated, or that there does seem like it is generally mild, or all that kind of stuff. It's milder in some ways, but just that thing. And if you're in this part of the country, starting something like 10 days ago, suddenly everyone has it. And I will say, just anecdotally, if you're still one of those people who has not gotten a booster, get a booster, because there's a lot of science to back this up. But I have seen, just anecdotally, in my own friend set, the people who, I don't know anybody who has a booster. And again, I'm not saying it happens to no one. I'm just saying, in my kind of social circle, the people who've been boosted, who've gotten COVID, have been pretty, it's been pretty mild. It hasn't been too much for them. And I know a few people, young people, young, like young, under 30, uh, who are vaccinated but not boosted. And I know a few of those people, they were like fucking wrecked for a week. And I'm sure these would still be considered mild, moderate cases in the broad sense. They weren't hospitalized. They obviously didn't die. But the difference between having what in the old days we might have considered like a mild cold versus like a bad flu where you are just wrecked for a week. So, get your booster shot. Obviously, I have to imagine that the listeners to this podcast tend to be people who are vaccinated. Obviously, if you're not vaccinated, get vaccinated. I mean, what the fuck? What are you thinking? But if you're not boosted, seriously, get the booster. It actually, you know, it makes a pretty big difference in terms of how you're going to spend a week or 10 days of your life. So we're going to talk about both those things, and we're also going to talk about something that in some ways strings these two things together, and that is that my co-host Kate Riga has been looking at the Supreme Court challenges to the there's not just one Biden vaccine mandate. There's a couple different ones that use different parts of federal law, the federal regulatory structure to mandate vaccines for different groups, and that obviously connects to COVID, but it also connects to the larger breakdown of sort of the function of the federal government, particularly at the legislative level, that to a great degree, what happens or does not happen in this country is a matter of what the president does unilaterally and what the Supreme Court allows the president to do unilaterally. Um, so a lot of different things factor in there, and one of the things one of the features of this period in our history is a corrupt Supreme Court majority and a largely corrupted federal judiciary that to a great extent now makes little pretense about operating from existing precedent uh, or even decisions that emerge from a consistent philosophical or interpretive framework to make judgments. The main hermeneutic seems to be, uh, does Joe Biden want it or not, and do Republicans want it or not, and that's kind of it with the current federal judiciary. So, not a great thing. Let me remind you that the Josh Marshall podcast is brought to you by Grady's Cold Brew Iced Coffee. Temperatures are dropping, leaves are falling, and the sun is setting halfway through your lunch break. But for everyone on Team Cold Brew, it's still iced coffee season. If you're a proud year-rounder, it's time to put on your mittens, fill your tumbler with ice, and top it off with Grady's New Orleans-style cold brew. With regular and decaf options, you can finally enjoy velvety smooth cold brew all day, every day, even in the depths of winter. Ready to savor every shiver? Get 25% off at Grady'sColdBrew.com with promo code TPM. That's Grady'sColdBrew.com with promo code TPM. So, Kate Riga, what's up?
So yesterday we had President Biden's big, kind of voting rights filibuster speech in Georgia. That was kind of the event that was going to kick off this big voting rights push. In some ways they had linked it to the January 6th insurrection, but this was a big moment because for months the refrain from activists has been Biden just doesn't have his heart in this. He's not pushing for voting rights the way that he is for infrastructure, for his economic agenda. And he hasn't given a speech really dedicated to the subject since the one he gave in Pennsylvania, I think last summer. So it's been a while. So the speech had a lot of scrutiny on it. Some activist groups boycotted it because they're angry at the inaction. And I think it was the strongest speech we've heard from him, perhaps in general, definitely on this topic. He kind of pulled out the stops, was very pointed in his criticism, framed everything in a historical kind of context. And now we're waiting to see what the Senate does. President Biden, I just learned from a senior aide, is coming to the Hill tomorrow to attend the Democratic senator's lunch. And Schumer's promised a vote on rules changes by or on Martin Luther King Day, which is next Monday. So we're kind of waiting to see exactly what the strategy is going to be there. But like the story's been all term, it all comes down to Manchin and Cinema. And in some ways, Schumer seems to kind of be expectation setting. He attended an event for the Center for American Progress last night where he said, I don't want to delude anyone. This is an uphill battle. These two senators do not want to change the rules. So, in that way, we're kind of back where we've been before, but with a lot more Biden interaction than we've seen in the past. So, what do you think of his speech?
I thought it was fine. Um, I, as you say, this comes down to those two votes, and one of the conversations that the Democratic Party and the parts of the party that are most involved in voting rights and democracy protection activism has been that yes, it's kind of going nowhere, but as you said in your introduction, Kate, that Biden has not prioritized it. He's been, not sure I totally agree with this, but the argument has been he's been kind of at best vague on the filibuster. He's not kind of crusading against it, and he's saying democracy protection is important, but he's not focusing on it the way that he is on Build Back Better and blah 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 blah. And if he would only bring the power of the bully pulpit online and focused on this, that's what's going to be necessary to break everything free. And I have always been skeptical, frankly, of that premise. I think it is just. I think. I think people kind of don't fully understand what the power of the president is certainly in such a polarized period, right? In different eras in our history, with less polarization, when the president kind of breaks in on normal programming and says, "Hey, this is critical. This is absolutely important." That's gonna shake everybody up. But it doesn't shake people up because everybody's already kind of in their on their sides in the big American political polarization. And uh, you know this isn't Lyndon Johnson. And when I say it's not Lyndon Johnson, it's not that Joe Biden isn't up to that challenge. Maybe he is or maybe he isn't, but he doesn't have 70 seats in the Senate, which Lyndon Johnson had. Lyndon Johnson had in the high 60s to I think 70 at one point in 64, 66, and whatever. And I think one of the reasons that the White House has been reluctant is you don't want to put everything on the line and then lose, because that just makes you seem weak. It's what is that thing? It's better to be assumed stupid and stay silent and be assumed stupid than rather than speak up and prove it, or whatever that phrase is. Is similar thing. People kind of see he's weak, but you prove you're weak. So I think it was great, but I'm still kind of waiting to hear, like, okay, is there something happen here that Joe Manchin is in a different place now, or Kirsten Sinema or something like that. And I've wondered whether um, is Manchin gonna relent here, since he already kind of destroyed the president's fiscal policy agenda? Is he gonna like throw him a bone? And because and frankly, I kind of wonder if that's why the White House did this, because they need to get some wins on something. I mean, he really seems to. I mean, I can't even. I'm almost ideologically opposed or temperamentally opposed at this point to paying attention to what's happening with the Build Back Better thing, because it's like being toyed with or something. So I think it was great. I'm not sure if it matters that it was great.
Yeah, to some degree, I think the whole Biden can change things premise serves certain invested groups, and that's why we keep hearing about it. It serves reporters who are trying to keep this storyline alive and write a story that's not just voting rights push continues, mansion and cinema are the obstacles. And I think it also serves activists who are looking at an impossible, depressing, potentially calamitous situation and trying to find the chess piece that hasn't been used yet. And that just leaves them with Biden not being full throatedly in support of this push. So they're channeling a lot of their energy onto him, which I think is understandable because what's your other option? You can
Yeah.
leave a message with a mansion and cinema intern. That's kind of all that's left. So I understand it. And to some degree, I'm kind of the mindset now of there's not a ton more for the administration to lose at this moment. So, I don't really see Biden pulling his punches on the voting thing as keeping, helping him maintain a lot of stature that he would lose otherwise. I think this is kind of a dark period for them, so they
Right.
might as well
Right.
try. But yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I've been listening to everything Manchin's been saying, and he clearly has a reform that's stuck in his mind, which is getting two-thirds of the people present to vote for something rather than two-thirds of the whole chamber. He's brought that up in every interview he's done in the last 2 weeks, which is something. But the thing that's not clear to me is that he often in the same breath says, and that's something Democrats and Republicans should be able to get together on, blah, 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 blah.
Right.
His same kind
Right.
of just, I don't even think you can call it naivete at this point. I think it's more akin to like when white people say, I don't really understand the racial dynamics here. I don't know. I don't know about that kind of stuff. Just using ignorance as a cover for having to do any work or have any responsibility in the matter.
Yeah,
So,
I don't it's very I mean, for what it's worth, I actually think even that minor reform, if I'm understanding the mechanics of it, would be a fairly big deal because it, the the real key with the current filibuster, and this is something it's always important to remind people because it's not automatically clear, it's not the minority does not have to get 40 seats on the floor. The minority literally does not even have to show up. They can all be out of town, and the majority still has to get 60 seats on the floor. So the minority has to do nothing. There's no pressure on them. There's no pressure to be on hand. And at least again, as I understand that, if you need if it's two-thirds of the people, what is it? Two-thirds of the senators actually present.
yep. Hmm.
Okay, so in that case, in theory, you could say, okay, Republicans, head out on break, and then say we might call all the Democrats back on short notice, and then there's maybe there's only us and five Republicans, and we'll go to the floor and we'll do it, and then we'll pass it, and that way you get a lot of pressure on because it then it becomes a thing where the majority can keep everybody off balance and be looking for a moment. Can we find a moment where we can get it's just us and we'll push it through? That actually is a big deal. With Manchin, like who knows what his I have no idea. I think your analogy is really quite a good one because it is that kind of not so much feigned ignorance, but just sort of chatter. Like, I don't want to do it. And you're just like, wah, 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 kind of like Peanuts, the adults on Peanuts, wah, 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 just, it doesn't, none of it matters. And I have no idea. And, yeah. So, yeah,
I mean, because the thing is, if he's down with that reform, super, it is much less, it's not as far as people would like, obviously, but that is a far cry better than nothing. But the thing is, if that's tied into Republican buy in, then it's nothing. It
yeah,
means nothing. It means nothing more than saying, I support the For the People Act, but I also support the filibuster. That's meaningless. You don't actually support the For the People Act then. And meanwhile, we've got cinema saying nothing because, and I know I say this all the time, but I really don't think it gets enough airtime, which is that she does not talk to reporters in anything but very controlled settings with like pre-selected reporters to do interviews that have from every outlet who's gotten one come out in this cinema's not apologizing to anyone,
Yeah,
kind of thing.
yeah, she's terrible.
I just
She's a bad senator, and
yeah.
she is not honest with her constituents, and I don't know what her deal is exactly. But your point is really right. I mean, for all the things about Joe Manchin, he's available.
Yep.
I think you mentioned to me, not just in our private exchanges, that he's reduced his availability to one gaggle or scrum a day just for COVID reasons.
Mhm.
Not constantly talking, but he's talking to people constantly.
Yeah.
Um, and she's probably as much an impediment as he is, but I mean, when was the last time even anybody even talked about her? Right? It's kind of he's that was I still don't know what the story was with, his temper tantrum about allegedly being singled out, which he wasn't. But I mean, uh yeah, I
Yeah.
have no idea. And I kind of, I do think, I will say this, it's important to hold a vote, even if it just ends up codifying what we think we already know, because not holding votes has allowed these two. I mean, this is why there's some institutionalist types who are kind of like, you need to get back to regular order. Regular order, when you have bills, you mark things up. You have a whole legislative process with hearings and markups and votes and votes and votes, and everybody sees what you're doing. But the way we do things these days, when everything has broken down, is that Manchin is the impediment, but he actually hasn't voted against anything, and he's never actually said, "I oppose this. I'm voting against the Build Back Better Act because I don't want it to pass." It's all like, yeah, I'm trying, I'm into it, and there's just squishiness and lack of accountability. So with the filibuster thing, they should have them say, yeah, I'm voting to keep the filibuster in exactly this form. And like, yeah, like you may be saying like, oh, great, Josh, I'll feel better after that happened. But you should feel a little bit better because it just puts everybody, that's what democracy is about. What's your position? Codify it. Make it explicit. Make it, you made a decision, you made a vote, and it's permanent. It's on the record, and everybody can kind of draw their own conclusions. Squishiness is the enemy of parliamentary democracy,
And
really.
it's also we've just reached a point where it's kind of like, okay, what's the other option other than putting them on the record, right? It's these kind of prolonged backdoor
Yeah.
negotiations where we get like little trickles, and Manchin comes out and says, I'm talking to everyone, I'm open minded, and nothing changes. And it's kind of we've been doing that for a year at this point. So I agree with you. I know I understand why Schumer hasn't wanted to hold this vote. I mean, it's embarrassing to be kind of sabotaged by your own party, but there's gotta be a button on this in some kind of way that either, you know, that perhaps gives the administration the final sign to be like, the Senate is no longer really a player in governing, and we gotta figure out a way around it, or something else to do with the rest of the presidency because it's not gonna happen. You can't buy Mansion and Cinema or it would have happened already. So, what's plan B?
No, it's at a certain level. And I mean, for me, we've passed this level. They're just wasting our time.
Right.
We've the whole country has spent, or at least the political country, the people who sort of really focus on politics, and certainly the people who live and breathe it. We've been kind of going through this cycle for a year now, and kind of like, you don't want to you don't want to let go of something like the Build Back Better Act and its various, various possible permutations, or the For the People Act. But at a certain point, you're just being played with. They're just making a fool of people. To keep talking about this, where it's almost like you expect that Joe Manchin goes back to his office after he has the scrum. Reporters go out and kind of like, well, Joe Manchin said this and Joe Manchin said that, and you kind of expect he goes back to the office laughing at everybody because he knows he's not doing anything. He's just toying with everybody. No, again, I've sort of, I've lost patience with trying to analyze what this guy's deal is. Who cares what his deal is? His deal is clearly not passing either, any of these things. And I can say that categorically and confidently. And if he wants to prove me wrong, go for it, dude. Right? I'd love it. I'd love to be proved wrong. It's not going to happen.
Yeah, I think this is a good segue, the kind of paralyzed Senate and taking Congress out of the equation as a member of, the governing body of our country. And talk a little bit about the Supreme Court, which I've been doing a lot of reporting on lately. So late last week, we had two vaccine mandates from the administration come before the court. One of those is a vaccine or test mandate from OSHA for all employers of over 100 employees. And then the other is from HHS. It's a mandatory vaccine policy for all healthcare workers who work at facilities that participate in Medicare or Medicaid, so that get federal funding. And the reason we were interested in this case is kind of twofold, both facially, because obviously vaccine mandates are quite important in this, especially during the spike of the pandemic, which is overburdening hospitals and sickening healthcare workers, et cetera. But also, and what I've been absolutely fixated on these past 2 weeks, is what it could potentially mean for the Biden administration's agency authority going forward. And while that might sound kind of weedy and kind of procedural, administrative law stuff, as we're describing, there could be nothing more important than what these agencies will be allowed to do, given that the Senate is utterly paralyzed right now and that Republicans are favored to take back the House, if not also the Senate, in 2022, which basically takes all legislating off the table for the rest of Joe Biden's term, which means all he's going to be able to do is whatever he can do with the regulatory and rulemaking power of the federal agencies. So I was watching these arguments with a real specific eye on what the justices were going to say and how their attitude was going to be towards the exercise of agency power. And what happened was more than I expected, because these vaccine mandates were cases where they didn't necessarily have to get into that side of things. There was enough kind of technical, procedural, what is OSHA's authority? What's their statutory, power, that kind of stuff, that they didn't necessarily have to get into those broader questions. But they really did. I mean, in particular, you had Chief Justice John Roberts saying this is just a quote workaround for the administration. They're doing these mandates through various agencies because they can't get it through Congress. So shouldn't we be looking at this as one comprehensive exercise of federal power? And, Neil Gorsuch echoed the same thing. And it was very forceful. And, it's kind of the culmination of what's been happening on the right wing of the judicial world for years. That really sped up during the Obama administration. This move to yank back power from federal agencies, and to really shift that power to courts made up of people who are not elected. It is not a democratic body by any means. And we've now kind of reached the point where we've got probably 5 votes on the court ready to absolutely curtail all federal agency power. And probably under the guise of saying, well, shouldn't this be Congress's power, when they know, as well as anybody else, that Congress can no longer govern in any meaningful way. And this is really, really going to come to a head with a case I've been doing some reporting on, that's going to come up in February, which is a case where the about the EPA's power to regulate greenhouse gases. And that's the one that experts think if there's going to be some huge kind of cutting off of agency power in the knees, it will probably happen during this case. And that could prove, absolutely damning for the Biden administration for the rest of their term.
I mean, it's just for listeners, the without getting too deep into the case law and administrative law, a broad framework that we've had for many decades is that the standard or one of the standards is a reasonability standard. If the law gives agencies a mandate to regulate in certain areas, it's not a matter of if the court agrees with the decision. It a reasonable decision? Is it a reasonable way of putting a law into effect, of taking stock of the facts available about whatever you're trying to regulate, etc. And one thing that is clear is that the court has dropped that. They have, even if it hasn't been embodied yet in a specific kind of groundbreaking decision, it's clear in a lot of these cases they're willing to just say, I don't think you should do this. That's not basically, I wouldn't have done that, and I'm the judge. So I'm gonna say you can't do it. Um, and that is a pretty big deal. And that's you know, I mean, as you say, given that the authority of the courts is essentially unreviewable and not accountable to any democratic authority, that is a pretty big deal. And it was striking to me in these oral arguments on these vaccine mandates, having members of the court basically spouting from the bench what are essentially kind of anti-vaccine conspiracy theories. I think it was Neil Gorsuch saying, "This isn't really about this is about control. This is about power, about controlling people. It's not about public health." Well, you can disagree with these mandates, and I think there's even it's funny. I there's a Federalist, kind of non-Trump Federalist Society lawyer who I engage with sometimes on Twitter, and when the administration first came out with this 100 employee mandate, I think his point was that broadly this worked in constitutional federal jurisprudence terms. They were probably going to need to tailor it a bit more narrowly to basically is the argument, the anti-mandate argument would be 100 employees is just a totally arbitrary number you've come up with. It's gonna the rationale for a mandate is much greater for in-person work versus people working from home. So you're going to need to tailor it more specifically to goals that are part of OSHA's mandate. So basically it's legit. You're going to have to kind of fiddle with it a bit to tailor it a bit more narrowly. But it seems like the Supreme Court isn't they don't even think that. They want to throw out the whole thing. And the other thing that really strikes me is I can see some argument that there's an argument kind of like, okay, this is not really, and this is I think what Roberts was getting at. You can kind of apply OSHA here, but this probably is not this is not what the authors of the law exactly had in mind. You can say, hey, you're kind of bootstrapping it here. That's reasonable. Again, court's supposed to give a fair amount of deference to the federal government on this. But what's really striking is the other mandate, which is about basically it's saying, if we the federal government are paying for you to give medical care to American citizens, if we're footing the bill, we need you to have your employees vaccinated. I don't even care about what the jurisprudence is on this. It is absurd that the government cannot require that. It is absolutely the case. It is unquestionable that this directly impacts the health of the people to whom the services are being provided. And it's the federal government that is paying the bill. It would be sort of like, I mean, the federal government has all sorts of standards. Like you have to have an antiseptic medical facility. If you're providing like dialysis to people with kidney failure, you've got to keep everything sanitary if we're paying the bill. That's just obvious. But and it's really kind of the same thing. If we're running if we're funding your healthcare facility, your kind of assisted living facility, or what they used to call old folks homes, everybody's got to be vaccinated. That's just obvious. And so that thing is kind of like, that to me is, I mean, you're paying the bill. You define what the product is. That's not even that's really not even that's really a principle that goes beyond even the issues we're talking about with federal power, mandates, or regulatory authority. Why are we going to pay your bill if you won't even provide a medically safe facility? It's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, and not to mention that Medicare, Medicaid patients are people who tend to be older, sicker, and poorer than the general population, all of which puts you at, greater risk to suffer more from catching COVID. But the real shift that was so demonstrated during these oral arguments is that previously we had decades where the attitude was agencies are staffed by experts and these, often technical matters. And the idea was Congress gives these agencies power. The courts are there when there's kind of an ambiguity or a question of the power that's been conferred. But the for so long, the deference was to the agencies. They know what they're doing better than courts do, and in some of the lower court litigation of these mandates, one conservative judge said essentially, we don't want to kind of replace the public health experts who are making this decision. We're judges. That's what do we know about public health kind of thing. And that was the attitude for a long time. But it was startling and alarming to see the right-wing judges on the Supreme Court kind of take this attitude of, if there's any ambiguity whatsoever, if Congress didn't explicitly give the agency, this specific power, then you assume that they didn't give them that power. And then the court's going to decide whether or not they have that power. And even when they did say it specifically, with the healthcare case, HHS is given the power to regulate the health and safety of its patients. I mean, it seems very, very explicit. That still might not be enough. It seemed like there were enough judges leaning away that would get shot down too. And so, all of this just paints a picture of a bench that is not going to let the Biden administration's agencies do a whole lot of anything. And that's, as bad as the vaccine mandate case is, tenfold when we get to this EPA case if they maintain the same posture, given that Congress hasn't passed a piece of major environmental legislation since 1990. So prospects are not exactly great there.
It's a few decades ago, there was, and this is still, at least in the abstract, a good argument, or a reasonable argument. The argument coming from conservative judges and conservative legal academics is that you are moving away from democratic accountability if Congress just says, "Oh, new agency of good stuff and being nice. We are empowering you to do good stuff and being nice, and go to it." And then you get a bunch of technically kind of appoint, technically working at the behest of the president of the United States, but in practice, big bureaucracies that are making, kind of the substantive decisions of government, and the Congress is basically abdicating its role. And in that context, you want to say, okay, we need to keep the Congress involved, because the Congress is what is elected by the people, and they need to get the let out and pass laws, and not just, again, kind of abdicate in that sense. That is a reasonable argument, uh, at least in concept. Um, there were always many proponents of that argument, or people pushing that argument, that in fact wanted to fundamentally hobble the existence of the modern US federal government, which goes back, depending on when you want to date it from, 120, 130 years or so. Uh, and basically make it not a workable proposition, to kind of clip its Achilles heels, basically, and make it not able to work. And this is, during the Trump administration, this was, Steve Bannon always with his slogans, to destroy, what is it, destroy or overthrow the administrative state. And that's kind of what that is about. And clearly that is, when you're saying that the federal government can't do things, that when the federal government is paying for citizens' medical care, if it can't say you've got to have a safe facility, well, this isn't about democratic accountability. That's just, you're trying to kind of break things, and this is why, one of the reasons I refer to the current Supreme Court majority as corrupt, because this is a corruption of the system, and that's where we are.
Yeah. Now for something a bit different, we're going to talk about the attempt to keep Madison Cawthorn, a representative from North Carolina, off the ballot in 2022. And this kind of, I don't know, in this kind of interesting way that they're going about it. Basically, it's a group of 11 North Carolina voters who have lodged a legal challenge to the state board of elections, saying that Cawthorn should be ineligible to have his name on the ballot in 2022 under the 14th Amendment because he helped incite an insurrection. So they're represented, among others, by a former Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court. Um, and yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. It's not a lawsuit per se because it's before the state entity.
Well, I
If
guess technically that's probably, a lawsuit, I think, is just, maybe I may not have my kind of semantics and definitions right here. It's just kind of going into court and trying to get like an injunction. So,
Yeah,
but
but I guess
you're
it's
not
not
suing
technically a
someone.
court. Yeah, I don't.
Right.
It's interesting. It's interesting, and it's the thing that if it would kind of go from here, would probably get litigated through the state court system.
Yeah,
Um,
unquestionably.
but yeah, that's where it's at now. What's your initial impression of this?
It's I think it is an interesting and positive move, in as much as this is going to litigate the question at some level. Is basically saying, just for listeners, the 14th Amendment is the middle of the three civil, post Civil War amendments, and in the process of, kind of giving people due process, and the privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States, they put in a thing saying, oh yeah, if you were part of the Civil War, i.e., if you were involved in leading an insurrection against the United States government, you're out. You can't be in the government anymore. And eventually they kind of pardon people, and blah 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 blah. So what we're litigating here, like, does this apply? It didn't say the Civil War. It was focused on the Civil War, but it basically said if you're involved in, if you're an insurrectionist, you're out. You're kind of you're out of the system. And so we're going to litigate, is what happened last year one of those things? Um and that's good to litigate because we can agree or disagree about whether this meets that constitutional standard, but we should be taking seriously that it is something like it. And this isn't some, kind of wild-eyed interpretation of the Constitution. It's written right in there. Um, so I think it's, I mean, it's the challenge that people on the non-democracy destroying side of these questions always face is, are we getting into a cycle of tit for tat that is going to be destructive? And I kind of doubt he's going to be uh uh removed from the ballot and all that kind of stuff. But I think it's good to litigate it. Let's get it out there. Let's get in some sort of formal um forum to talk about the insurrection and what was involved in it. So, cheers to them. I think it's very it's creative, and you shouldn't try to overthrow the government. That's a good place to start.
Yeah, I mean, I think the sticking point to me with the efficacy of the suit itself is that it seems that you would have to prove that he engaged in an insurrection to kind of win the claim. And that's hard for a number of reasons, including that there's some ambiguity about what body is in charge of proving that claim in the amendment. It kind of seems like Congress, perhaps, and maybe you could make the argument that a court could decide that. But if there's one kind of lesson we've learned since the insurrection, it's that it's proven difficult to really prove that a lawmaker was engaged in the insurrection, or that, kind of comments at the rallies or stoking the big lie equals engaging in insurrection. I think we've seen that particularly with attempts to kind of tie Trump as directly culpable for it. So that to me seems the area where it would probably stumble. Um, but I kind of agree with you, just in that so many people have kind of skated by who played a huge role in it. And I think some of that was because in the second impeachment, they made the executive decision not to go after the Republican lawmakers and really to focus on Trump as to not, alienate the jurors essentially. But
Right.
I think a byproduct of that decision is that some people who were almost, if not as culpable as Trump, have basically gotten away scot free.
Right.
So I do think that the kind of, like you say, the litigation of this question of getting what he did into headlines, into the public consciousness, of not letting people forget right before he runs for reelection again just how gung ho he was about this whole thing is a net positive, whether or not this kind of legal bid works out.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to remember that the context of the passage of the 14th Amendment is you're letting insurrectionist states back into the union. And so you're basically kind of saying at the front end, like, don't send don't send insurrectionists back to Congress. Those people are out. So I think logically it speaks to the Congress itself not seating those people. Again, a lot of those there was a process of everybody event, most people eventually got pardoned. Um, but so Congress is the logical place, but the states clearly have a role because, the Congress sets age limits for the different things. And if you show up as a 22-year-old, say, "Hey, I just got elected to the House. Here I am." Congress would say, "No, you can't. You're not eligible." But we also expect the states not to send those people. So it we have all sorts of precedent. It's clearly for both, right? Don't send us people we can't. They both have a role, and I totally agree with you. We have this a whole series of evidentiary and conceptual questions about, what counts. But at some level, you want to say, like, it was an insurrection. Maybe you can say you just kind of said, you just sort of like did a whoop whoop a few times and said it was awesome, and that doesn't count. But you want to get the definition straight, because as we know, there's a lot of people saying, hey, it was just kind of a rally that got a little rambunctious, and don't have a cow, as we used to say when I was like a high schooler or something like that, right? Um, and so we want to kind of litigate that. We want to get it. We want to keep that into the mix. Keep that in the mix, not let it go down the memory hole. That something dramatic and existential to the existence of the republic happened, and to keep the focus on that. And if you want to explain how you weren't really involved, great. Let's litigate that. Let's keep it fresh.
Right. Okay, as we wrap up here, Josh, why don't you give us a little bit of a summary of kind of the great COVID schools debate that's been happening on the pages of the Ed blog and with your interactions with readers?
Well, so yeah, I've published a few things myself, and I've published a number of letters responses, and we have the Omicron wave. I think schools in this country for in some places a little less than a year, in some places well over a year, or remote. Everybody across the spectrum uh, agrees that sucked. The question is, a lot of things sucked during the epidemic. Maybe it was necessary, maybe it wasn't, but everybody's come out of that, or a lot of people have come out of that. All right, we're never going to do that again. We've got more drugs, we've got vaccines. We're never going to close the schools again. We're not going to go back to remote. There's a pretty broad consensus there, but there's also people who've made it like a doctrine. Like, you cannot even close for a day. And there's just a lot of people out there with incredibly strong feelings on both sides of this for understandable reasons. And my one input on this is we shouldn't be having doctrines. We shouldn't be having absolutes. This is a fluid thing. Everybody's trying to kind of figure things out. And just my experience as a parent in the New York City school system, in the first week back after break, tons of everybody's out sick, and everybody's quarantining, and no one's even teaching in class because half the kids aren't there. You're a certain point, like, okay, maybe some districts are gonna shut down for 3 days just to kind of get through this surge or something like that. And there's a lot of if I were on the other side of the political spectrum, I might call them, kind of pointy headed elites with their PhDs working from home, lecturing everybody about how schools can absolutely never close, when it's like a disaster area in these schools. And not a disaster area in the sense of, for a vast majority of the kids, they're vaccinated, they're young, they're not having serious health problems. The teachers can be vaccinated. So it's not like it would have been a year and a half ago, but it's still a mess. It's just not a context in which you can really run classes for some period of time. And so the responses that we've published have really, I think, been looking across the spectrum. You have a lot of educators who are just really, really pissed that this is all fallen on them to take this risk on themselves, and they've been run ragged after 2 years. And you got people who need to go to work, and if their kids they can't leave their kids at home, and everybody's pissed. And I think some people have somewhat better reasons to be pissed than others, but everybody's got some reason to be pissed. And that is kind of, in a lot of ways, just the story of the epidemic, that the society has just been run ragged. And everybody's got a lot of grievances, and most people have good reasons for having those grievances, and that's just the state of where we are. And I think for all of us, there is a lot of tendency, and I include myself among this. There's a lot of tendency to kind of focus on some grievances and enlist them on the policy side that you think is best. But the reality is the society's run ragged and everybody's upset, and that is why the whole society is under a lot of stress and everybody's having a hard time.
Yeah. Okay, we're gonna take one question from Greg, who sent us an article in The Guardian that was basically a write up of what this political scientist in Canada who specializes in, kind of decaying democracies and rise of political violence, put out a warning to his countrymen saying that their neighbor to the south could be in total civil violence and turmoil by 2025. And then by 2030, the United States could be under a full scale right wing dictatorship. Um, the thing that I thought was kind of funny about this not funny prediction is he basically said this is going to be really terrible for us Canadians, which I get it. That's where he lives. As an American, I would say I read this and I was like, well, okay, but I think we Americans might be doing a bit worse. But one of the things he cites as the danger to Canada is that uh, political prisoners could flee to Canada and they would have to deal with whether to extradite those people back to the grasps of
It's a very
dystopian America.
Canadian, it's a very Canadian kind of problem, kind of
Yeah,
a very
exactly.
a very small bore, kind of administrative low energy question.
Right.
I want to get on the case of our Canadian listeners and Canadian friends. Um, but yeah.
I mean, you gotta laugh. Otherwise you'd cry. But it's the kind of thing where I think the real issue here is not that people who are incredibly plugged into politics don't see this danger. I think we do. I think it's made our jobs like unbelievably stressful in these past few years. But the danger that I see is that less politically in tune people don't seem to be internalizing this risk the way that people who watch politics every day are. I think that's represented in the polling, which keeps showing that Republicans are more concerned about, a denigrating democratic system than Democrats are, which it's clearly a direct result of the big lie and everything. But I just think it shows that there's not this fear activation in Democratic constituents that there should be. And I think in some ways it's the reinforcing cycle of the Democratic leadership not really pounding the alarm because they can't get anything through Congress. So they've been tempering the message somewhat, and then it doesn't drip down to the constituents who then don't force the lawmakers to take it more seriously. And then also, just kind of coming off what you just said, everyone is struggling during the pandemic, no matter if you're a parent of young children or someone who doesn't get to work from home or someone who's lucky in almost every way during the pandemic and is still just kind of emotionally not doing great. To some extent everyone's suffering, and I think in that way your immediate circumstances probably take precedent over these still abstract threats, especially when the news cycle is just so depressing. I mean, I know that if I didn't work in it, I would probably take a break, wouldn't have my face pushed up against the glass every day. So I think all of that's probably playing in.
Yeah, I mean, it's I think it is always, it's always easy to interpret or overinterpret the public mind. We had this big thing that happened last January 6th, and you kind of couldn't miss it. No one did. Everybody saw what happened, and public opinion reflected that. A lot of us have drawn conclusions about what could happen in the future based on that, and I think those conclusions have a lot of merit. Most people are kind of living their lives, and one of the things that COVID has done, as you say, has meant that all of us have a lot more life to live. And what I mean by that is just getting through the day requires a lot these days. And some of us more than others. I'm one of those, incredibly privileged people who've been able to kind of ride this out pretty much entirely at home for 2 years. But people got a lot to deal with, and it's hard just to get through the day. And it's a bit hard to focus on, what could happen in 2026, or what could happen in 2024 if this thing happens and that thing happens and the other thing happens. I mean, I'm pretty skeptical that prediction is going to come to pass. I think what we're one of the things that we have been in the mix of, bound to over the last 5, 6, 7 years, is seeing things in very totalizing terms. Is democracy going to end or not end? Are we going to have a civil war or not have a civil war? These kind of things, and things tend to work in more incremental ways. And that can, reassure people in some ways, but it that also means things kind of creep up on you, right? I mean, I saw one of the. It's hard to go too long these days without seeing someone say, "Oh, the country's going to have another civil war," blah 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 blah. Well, there's no way you're going to have a symmetric geographical civil war, because really the country isn't red states and blue states. It's big urban areas again, and kind of the people who live past the inner suburbs, right? I mean, there's just no way you can have an old, kind of something like what we had in the 1860s. But what you can have is just kind of a breakdown of civil order and more widespread violence, assassination, kind of just a breakdown of the normal functioning of things. And one of the things that means is that it can just kind of creep up on you. I mean, it's already kind of started. We had this one terrorist plot where a bunch of sort of fanatical Trump supporters wanted to kidnap and assassinate the governor of Michigan. Right? I mean, we've had various instances of right-wing violence over the last couple years. Certainly, people on the right will point to big public demonstrations in 2020. We can say accurately those were overwhelmingly nonviolent, but there was some violence. There were people, doing violent things, and we had a mob overrun the Capitol a year ago. So this isn't some binary thing that's out in the future. It's a trend, and that I don't know if that makes it better or worse, but I guess these extreme scenarios should not blind us to the fact that we are daily making decisions that push us further down that road or kind of pull us back in the opposite direction. It's all incremental. It all builds on itself. And I don't know, everybody has to stay engaged as much as they can.
Yep.
Okay, well, on that happy note, let me remind you that the Josh Marshall podcast is brought to you by Grady's Cold Brew Iced Coffee. You can get 25% off at gradyscoldbrew.com with promo code TPM. And that's it for this episode.
All right. Thanks,
Later.
guys. The Josh Marshall podcast is hosted by me, TPM reporter Kate Riga, and TPM founder, editor-in-chief Josh Marshall. The show is produced by Jackie Wilhelm. Thanks to Why Not Jansfeld for our podcast theme song, and thanks to all our TPM members who make this possible. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and subscribe wherever you listen.